The knife blade caught the afternoon sun as Georgia Harper pressed it against the bark of the ancient cottonwood, her hand trembling slightly as she carved the first curve of the letter G into the weathered trunk. She had ridden 3 miles from Apache Junction, Arizona, just to find a place where no one would see her cry, where no one would ask questions about why a woman of 22 was carving her name into a tree like some lovesick schoolgirl saying goodbye to everything she had ever known. The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory stretched wild and untamed around her, all red rock and sagebrush and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Georgia had arrived in Apache Junction only 6 months ago with her father, a prospector who swore he would strike it rich in the Superstition Mountains. Instead, he had struck fever, and 3 weeks ago she had buried him in the small cemetery on the edge of town. Now she was alone with a failing claim, dwindling supplies, and the very real knowledge that a woman without family or fortune in this harsh country had precious few options ahead of her. She finished the G and started on the E, blinking back tears that she refused to let fall. The cottonwood stood beside a narrow creek that ran down from the mountains, its leaves whispering in the hot breeze. This spot had become her refuge these past weeks, the only place where she could breathe without feeling the weight of every decision pressing down on her chest. "That is a fine piece of work you are doing there." Georgia spun around so fast she nearly dropped her knife, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man who stood 10 feet away had appeared without a sound, as if the desert itself had conjured him. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and arms that strained against the worn fabric of his buckskin shirt. Dark hair fell past his collar, and several days' worth of beard shadowed a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the mountains behind him. But it was his eyes that caught her, a striking blue-gray that seemed to see straight through every defense she had ever built. "I did not hear you approach," Georgia said, proud that her voice came out steady despite the way her pulse was racing. She kept the knife visible in her hand, not threatening but not hidden either. The man raised both hands slightly, palms out in a gesture of peace. "Did not mean to startle you, miss. I have been tracking a mountain lion that took down one of my traps up the creek. Saw your horse and wanted to make sure you were not in any danger." His voice was deep and rough, like stones tumbling in a river, but there was something gentle in it too. Georgia glanced past him to where her mare Sage stood grazing peacefully. "I appreciate your concern, but as you can see, I am perfectly fine." The man's gaze moved from her to the tree, and she saw something shift in his expression. "You are carving your name. That is none of your concern." She turned back to the cottonwood, hoping he would take the hint and leave. Instead, she heard the soft crunch of his boots on the dry earth as he moved closer. "Name is Harrison Pike," he said. "I have a cabin about 5 miles north of here, up in the foothills. Been living in these mountains near 8 years now." He paused. "I know who you are. You are James Harper's daughter. I am sorry for your loss. He was a good man." Georgia's throat tightened. She had not expected kindness, and somehow that made it harder to maintain her composure. "Thank you," she managed. "Did you know my father well?" "Well enough. He came up to my place a few times, trading supplies, talked about you often, said you were the smartest person he knew, man or woman." Harrison's voice carried no flattery, just simple statement of fact. She pressed the knife against the bark again, focusing on the next letter. "He exaggerated." "I do not think so." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sounds the whisper of cottonwood leaves and the gentle murmur of the creek. Georgia could feel Harrison's presence behind her, solid and somehow comforting in a way that made no sense given that they had only just met. "Why are you carving your name here?" Harrison asked quietly, Georgia's hand stilled. She could have lied, could have told him it was none of his business, but something in his tone made her tell the truth instead. Because I wanted to leave something of myself in a place that meant something to me. Because in a few weeks, I will likely be leaving Apache Junction, and I wanted there to be some proof that I was here, that I existed in this place even if only for a short time. Why would you leave? She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Because I cannot work my father's claim alone. Because the bank will not extend me credit. Because I have enough money to last perhaps another month if I am very careful, and then I will have to go back east and throw myself on the mercy of relatives, who made it very clear they thought my father was a fool for coming out here in the first place. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "May I borrow your knife?" Georgia turned to face him, confused. "Why?" He gestured to the tree. "I would like to carve something." She hesitated, then held out the knife handle first. Harrison took it, his calloused fingers brushing hers for just a second, and she felt a jolt of awareness run up her arm. He moved to the tree, studying the letters she had already carved, then positioned the blade a few inches to the right of where she had been working. "What are you doing?" Georgia asked, moving to see better. Harrison did not answer immediately. Instead, he began to carve with quick, sure strokes, the muscles in his forearms flexing as he worked. She watched, fascinated, as the letter H took shape in the bark, then an A, then two artichokes. Her breath caught as she realized what he was writing. "Harrison," she said. "What are you doing?" He finished the last letter of his first name and started on his surname. "Making it permanent," he said simply. "If your name is going to be on this tree, then mine should be beside it." "But why?" Georgia's heart was beating so hard she could barely hear her own voice over the rush of blood in her ears. Harrison paused, turning to look at her with those storm-colored eyes. "Because I do not think you should leave Apache Junction. Because this territory needs people like you, people who are not afraid of hard work and hard country. And because I think you deserve to know that you are not as alone as you believe yourself to be." Georgia stared at him, unable to form words. Harrison turned back to the tree and finished carving Pike into the bark, then stepped back to examine his work. Georgia and Harrison, carved side by side into the ancient cottonwood, their names intertwined by proximity and intention. "I do not understand," Georgia whispered. Harrison handed her knife back, his expression serious. "I am not a man who speaks pretty words or knows how to say things the way they ought to be said. But I know that when I heard your father had passed, my first thought was worry for you. I know that I have ridden down to the edges of town 3 times in the past 2 weeks hoping to catch a glimpse of you, to make sure you were managing. And I know that the thought of you leaving, of never seeing you again, sits in my chest like a stone." "You do not even know me," Georgia protested, but her voice was weak. "Then let me know you." Harrison took a step closer, and Georgia could smell pine and leather and something wild and clean like mountain air. "I am not asking you to make any promises. I am just asking you not to give up on this place yet. Not to give up on what you came here to build with your father." "I cannot work the claim alone," Georgia said again. But even as she spoke, she felt something shifting inside her, some small flame of hope that she had thought completely extinguished beginning to flicker back to life. "You would not be alone." Harrison's voice was steady, certain. "I know these mountains better than any man alive. I know where the good deposits are, how to read the rock. Your father's claim is in a promising area. With the right help, you could make it work." Georgia searched his face, looking for any sign of deception or ulterior motive, but all she saw was earnest sincerity. "Why would you help me? What would you want in return?" Harrison was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice was softer than before. "The chance to see you again." The chance to prove to you that not everyone in this world is out to take advantage. And maybe, if I am very fortunate, the chance to carve our names together in more than just a tree." Heat flooded Georgia's cheeks, and she looked away, overwhelmed by the intensity of his gaze. "That is very forward of you, Mr. Pike." "Harrison," he corrected. "And yes, I suppose it is. But I learned a long time ago that life out here is too short and too uncertain to waste time dancing around the truth. I am interested in you, Miss Harper. I have been since the first time I saw you riding through town with your father, sitting tall in the saddle with your hat tipped back and the sun in your face. I would like the opportunity to court you properly, if you will allow it." Georgia's mind was racing. This was madness. She had known this man for all of 10 minutes, but there was something about Harrison Pike that called to something deep inside her, something that recognized strength and steadiness, and a kind of wild integrity that she had rarely encountered in her life. "I do not know what to say," she admitted. "Say you will think about it. Say you will not make any decisions about leaving until you have given me a chance to show you what is possible here." Harrison held out his hand. "Say you will let me help you with your father's claim, at least for the next few weeks. No obligations, no expectations beyond that." Georgia looked at his outstretched hand, calloused and scarred from years of hard work and harder living. Then she looked at the tree, at their names carved side by side in the weathered bark. Something her father had told her once came back to her. The greatest adventures in life come from saying yes when every practical bone in your body is screaming no. She took Harrison's hand. His grip was warm and strong, and she felt that jolt of awareness again, stronger this time. "2 weeks," she said. "I will give it 2 weeks, and then I will reassess my situation." Harrison's face broke into a smile that transformed his rugged features, and Georgia felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. 2 weeks, he agreed. "That is all I ask." They stood there by the cottonwood tree, hands clasped, the Arizona sun beating down on them and the mountains rising purple and gold in the distance. Georgia had no idea what she had just agreed to, no idea where this path might lead, but for the first time since her father's death, she felt something other than grief and despair. She felt possibility. Over the next week, Harrison proved to be a man of his word. He appeared at her father's claim each morning just after dawn, bringing supplies and equipment, and an encyclopedic knowledge of mining that made Georgia realize just how little she and her father had actually known. He showed her how to read the geological formations, how to identify promising veins of ore, how to shore up the tunnels properly so they would not collapse. But more than that, he talked to her. Not at her, the way so many men did, but with her, asking her opinions and actually listening to her answers. He told her about his life in the mountains, about how he had come west after the war between the states, looking for a place where the ghosts of what he had seen and done could not follow him. He spoke of the solitude he had sought in these wild places, and how over time that solitude had turned from sanctuary into loneliness. Georgia found herself telling him things she had never told anyone. About her mother, who had died when Georgia was 12, and how she had taken over running the household for her grieving father. About the books she loved to read, adventures and explorations and scientific treatises that made her hungry for a wider world. About her dreams of building something meaningful, of leaving her mark on this vast and untamed land. They worked side by side in the claim, and Georgia could not help but notice the way Harrison's muscles moved beneath his shirt as he swung the pickaxe, the way sweat gleamed on his sun-bronzed skin, the way he would sometimes catch her looking and smile that transformative smile that made her stomach flutter. She found herself watching for him each morning, listening for the sound of his horse's hooves, and feeling disappointed on the rare occasions when he arrived later than usual. On the 8th day, they struck a promising vein of silver. Harrison was the one who spotted it, a thick seam running through the rock face that made his eyes light up with excitement. They worked for hours extracting samples, and when Harrison took them into town to be assayed, the results came back better than Georgia had dared to hope. With proper equipment and sustained work, her father's claim could actually be profitable. That evening, Harrison brought supplies for a celebratory dinner. They sat outside her small cabin as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, eating beans and cornbread and talking about next steps. Georgia found herself acutely aware of how close Harrison was sitting, how easy it would be to lean just a little to the side and rest her head against his broad shoulder. "You are quiet," Harrison observed, his voice gentle in the gathering dusk. Georgia looked at him, at the way the fading light caught in his eyes and turned them silver. "I am thinking," she said. "About what?" "About how 2 weeks ago I was ready to give up on everything, and now I am sitting here making plans for a future I had stopped believing in." She paused. "About how you changed everything just by carving your name beside mine in a tree." Harrison set down his plate and turned to face her fully. "Georgia," he said, and the way he spoke her name made her shiver despite the warmth of the evening. "These past 8 days have been the best days I have had in longer than I can remember. Working beside you, talking with you, watching you grow more confident in your own strength and capability. I know 2 weeks is not much time. I know you barely know me, but I need you to understand something." "What?" Georgia whispered. "I am falling in love with you." The words were simple, direct, devastating in their honesty. "I know I should wait, should court you properly for months before saying such a thing, but I have never been good at pretending and I do not want to start now. You asked me why I carved my name beside yours, and the truth is that I did it, because in that moment I knew I wanted to tie my life to yours in every way possible. I wanted to make a mark that would last, that would say to anyone who saw it that we belonged together." Georgia's breath caught. She should be scandalized, should tell him he was being far too forward, should maintain proper decorum and distance. Instead, she found herself saying, "I am falling in love with you too." Harrison's eyes widened slightly, as if he had not actually expected her to return the sentiment. Then, moving slowly enough that she could pull away if she wanted to, he reached out and cupped her face in his large, calloused hand. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," Georgia breathed, and then his lips were on hers and the world narrowed to just that point of contact, soft and warm and perfect. Harrison kissed her with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior, as if she were something precious and fragile that he was afraid of breaking. Georgia leaned into the kiss, her hand coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel the steady thunder of his heartbeat. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said softly. "Not just for 2 weeks. Stay and build a life here, with me." "Yes," Georgia said, and it was the easiest answer she had ever given. Over the following weeks, they fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Harrison moved some of his belongings down from his mountain cabin, setting up a small tent near Georgia's claim so he could be there to help with the work, and though neither of them said it explicitly, to protect her should any trouble arise. They worked the claim during the day, extracting ore and processing it with equipment that Harrison had acquired through his various connections in the territory. In the evenings they would sit together and talk, or sometimes just exist in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. Georgia learned that Harrison was an excellent cook, capable of making even simple ingredients taste like something special. Harrison learned that Georgia had a beautiful singing voice that she was shy about sharing, but which she would sometimes let loose when she thought he was not paying attention. They learned each other's histories, each other's fears and hopes and dreams. They learned how to work together, anticipating each other's needs and movements until they functioned like a single unit rather than two separate people, and they learned about desire. The attraction between them was undeniable, a constant low hum beneath every interaction. Harrison was always respectful, never pushing for more than Georgia was ready to give, but she could see the want in his eyes when he looked at her, could feel the restraint in his careful touches. For her part, Georgia found herself hyper-aware of Harrison's physicality, the sheer masculine power of him tempered by his gentle nature. She dreamed about him at night, waking flushed and restless, wanting things she had only read about in the pages of scandalous novels. One particularly hot afternoon in early September, they took a break from working the claim to swim in the creek where they had first met. Georgia wore a simple shift that clung to her body when wet, and she tried not to stare as Harrison stripped down to his trousers before diving into the water. His body was a landscape of muscle and old scars, testament to a hard life lived on the edge of civilization. When he surfaced, water streaming from his hair and running in rivulets down his chest, Georgia had to look away before she did something completely improper. "Come in," Harrison called, grinning. "The water feels amazing." Georgia waded in more carefully, gasping at the cold. Harrison swam over to her, and before she could react, he had scooped her up in his arms and carried her out to deeper water. "Harrison Pike, you put me down this instant." Georgia squealed, half laughing and half scandalized. "As you wish," Harrison said and dropped her. Georgia came up sputtering and immediately launched herself at him, trying to dunk him in retaliation. Harrison let her, laughing, and they wrestled playfully in the water until Georgia somehow ended up pressed against his chest, both of them breathing hard, the laughter dying as awareness took its place. "Georgia," Harrison said, his voice rough. His arms were around her waist, holding her against him, and she could feel every hard plane of his body through the thin fabric of her shift. "Kiss me," Georgia said, and Harrison did. This kiss was different from their first, deeper and more urgent. Harrison's hand came up to tangle in her wet hair, tilting her head back so he could kiss her more thoroughly. Georgia wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing closer, wanting to eliminate any space between them. They were both trembling by the time they broke apart. "We should stop," Harrison said, though he made no move to let her go. "I do not want to stop," Georgia admitted, her cheeks flushing but her eyes steady on his. Harrison groaned. "Georgia, I am trying very hard to be a gentleman here, but you are making it extremely difficult." "I do not want a gentleman," Georgia said boldly. "I want you. You deserve a proper courtship, a wedding." Harrison's jaw was tight with the effort of restraint. "Then marry me," Georgia said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. Harrison went very still. "What?" "Marry me," Georgia repeated, more certain now. "I know it has only been a few weeks. I know people will say we are rushing into things. But I know my own heart, Harrison, and I know that I love you. I know that I want to spend my life with you. So marry me." Harrison stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he let out a whoop of joy that echoed off the canyon walls, picked her up, and spun her around until they both were dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, he was grinning so wide it looked like his face might split. "Yes," he said. "Yes, 1,000 times yes. I will marry you, Georgia Harper, and I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you never regret asking me." They rode into Apache Junction the very next day to speak with the circuit preacher who came through town once a month. "Reverend," Samuel Matthews was a weathered man in his 60s who had seen enough of frontier life not to be surprised by much. But even he raised his eyebrows when Harrison and Georgia explained that they wanted to be married as soon as possible. "How long have you two been courting?" he asked, his tone more curious than judgmental. "About 3 weeks," Georgia said, lifting her chin defiantly, "but I know this is what I want." Reverend Matthews looked at Harrison. "And you, son, you are certain about this?" "More certain than I have been about anything in my life, sir," Harrison said firmly, his hand finding Georgia's and squeezing. The preacher studied them both for a long moment, then smiled. "Well, I have been doing this long enough to know that sometimes the heart knows things the head has not figured out yet. And I have to say, I have never seen two people look at each other the way you two do. If you are determined, I can perform the ceremony tomorrow afternoon. That will give you time to make any necessary arrangements and find some witnesses." They were married the following day in the small church at the edge of Apache Junction, with the afternoon sun streaming through the windows and a handful of townsfolk in attendance. Georgia wore a simple blue dress that she had owned for years, but had never had occasion to wear, and Harrison had gotten himself properly cleaned up, his hair tied back and his beard trimmed. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Harrison kissed her with such tenderness and joy that Georgia felt tears stream down her face. After the ceremony, several of the townspeople approached to offer their congratulations. Mrs. Ellen Wilson, who ran the general store, hugged Georgia tightly. "Your father would be so happy to see this," she whispered. "He always said you needed someone who could match your spirit." That night, Harrison took Georgia to his cabin in the mountains. The ride took several hours, winding up through foothills covered in scrub oak and juniper, until they reached a clearing that looked out over the valley below. The cabin itself was solidly built, much larger than Georgia had expected, with a stone fireplace and real glass windows and a wide porch that faced the view. "You built this?" Georgia asked, amazed. "Over the course of several years," Harrison said, dismounting and then lifting Georgia down from her horse. "I always figured that if I ever found a woman willing to share it with me, I wanted it to be a real home, not just a rough shelter." He carried her over the threshold, making her laugh at the old-fashioned gesture, and set her down gently in the main room. There was a real bed with a quilted coverlet, a table and chairs that looked handmade, shelves lined with books and supplies, and personal touches that revealed sides of Harrison she was still discovering. A collection of bird feathers in various colors. A sketch of the mountain range done in charcoal. A violin resting in the corner. "You play?" Georgia asked, gesturing to the instrument. Harrison looked almost embarrassed. "My mother taught me when I was a boy. I am not very good anymore, but sometimes it helps pass the long winter evenings." Georgia walked over and picked up the violin carefully. "Will you play for me? Maybe another time," Harrison said, and something in his voice made Georgia turn to look at him. He was watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Right now, I have other things on my mind." He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply. Georgia melted into him. All the anticipation and desire of the past weeks finally allowed free rein. Harrison's hands moved over her body, learning her shape through the fabric of her dress, and Georgia shivered at the sensation. "Are you nervous?" Harrison asked softly, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. "A little," Georgia admitted, "but I want this, I want you." Harrison kissed her again, then began slowly unfastening the buttons of her dress. "We will go as slow as you need," he promised. "If you want to stop at any point, just say so." But Georgia did not want to stop. She helped him with the buttons, her own hands shaking slightly as she worked at the fastenings of his shirt. When they finally came together, skin against skin, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Harrison was gentle and patient, guiding her through the unfamiliar territory of intimacy with a care that made Georgia love him even more. And when they finally joined together completely, Georgia understood for the first time why the Bible spoke of two becoming one flesh. She felt completed in a way she had never known she was incomplete, bound to this man not just by words spoken in a church, but by something far deeper and more primal. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the bed, Harrison's arms wrapped securely around her and Georgia's head resting on his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," Harrison murmured into her hair. "More than I knew it was possible to love another person." "I love you too," Georgia whispered back. "Thank you for carving your name beside mine." "Thank you for letting me make it permanent," Harrison replied. They settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. Georgia moved her belongings up to the mountain cabin, and together they worked both Harrison's trap lines and her father's silver claim. The claim proved even more profitable than they had initially hoped, and by December, they had enough money saved to hire 2 workers to help with the more labor-intensive aspects of the operation. Winter in the Arizona mountains was milder than it would have been further north, but there were still weeks when snow fell, and the temperature dropped low enough that venturing far from the cabin was unwise. Georgia discovered that she loved those quiet winter days, when she and Harrison would spend hours talking by the fire or reading aloud to each other from the books that lined the shelves. Harrison did eventually play the violin for her, and though he claimed to be rusty, Georgia thought it was the most beautiful music she had ever heard. They talked about their future during those long winter evenings, about expanding the mining operation or perhaps investing in other ventures, about building a larger house that could accommodate a family, about the children they both wanted, though Georgia admitted she was in no particular hurry to become pregnant just yet. "I am enjoying having you all to myself for a while," she confessed one snowy afternoon as they lay together in bed, drowsy and satisfied in the aftermath of lovemaking. Harrison grinned and pulled her closer. "I am certainly not going to argue with that," he said. "Though I do look forward to the day when we have little ones running around. I want a daughter who looks just like you." "And I want a son with your eyes," Georgia replied, then laughed. "Listen to us, planning out children we do not even have yet." "Nothing wrong with planning," Harrison said, "as long as we remember to enjoy the present too." Spring came early to the mountains that year, and with it a whole new set of challenges and opportunities. Word had spread about the quality of the ore coming from Georgia's claim, and they began receiving offers from investors and mining companies interested in buying them out or forming partnerships. Georgia and Harrison spent long hours discussing the various proposals, weighing the benefits of maintaining full control against the advantages of having additional capital and resources. In the end, they decided to accept a partnership with a reputable mining outfit out of Tucson, one that would provide equipment and expertise while allowing them to retain majority ownership and final say over operations. The deal was lucrative enough that Harrison was able to stop running trap lines entirely and focus his attention on the mining operation, where his knowledge of the mountains and his natural leadership abilities made him invaluable. As the operation expanded, so did their influence in Apache Junction. They became respected members of the community, known for treating their workers fairly and for their willingness to help neighbors in need. When a family of settlers had their crops fail during a particularly dry summer, Harrison and Georgia were the first to organize relief efforts. When the town needed funds to build a proper schoolhouse, they contributed generously, and Georgia volunteered to serve on the board that would hire teachers and set curriculum. Through it all, their love for each other only deepened. They had their disagreements, of course, moments of frustration and conflict that were inevitable when two strong-willed people built a life together. But they had also learned how to communicate, how to listen to each other and compromise when necessary. And they never went to bed angry, always making sure to resolve their conflicts before sleep claimed them. On their first anniversary, Harrison took Georgia back to the cottonwood tree where they had met. Their names were still carved in the bark, weathered slightly but clearly visible. Harrison pulled out his knife, and below their names carved the date of their wedding, making the marks deep enough that they would last for years to come. "So anyone who finds this will know the story," he explained, "of how I found a woman carving her name into a tree, and how I carved my name right beside hers to make it permanent." Georgia kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. "Best decision I ever made," she said when they finally pulled apart. "Letting you carve your name beside mine. Best decision I ever made was taking the chance to tell you how I felt," Harrison replied. "I could have just helped you with the claim and kept my feelings to myself. Could have been safe and careful and let you leave without saying a word. But I am so glad I did not." They picnicked beside the creek that afternoon, talking and laughing and making love on a blanket spread beneath the cottonwood's branches. And when the sun began to set, they rode back to their cabin in the mountains, both of them thinking about the future that stretched ahead, full of promise and possibility. That fall, Georgia discovered she was pregnant. She told Harrison one evening after dinner, simply and directly, and watched as his face transformed with wonder and joy. He was immediately solicitous, wanting to make sure she was not working too hard, that she was eating properly, that she was comfortable and happy. Georgia found his protectiveness endearing, though she also had to remind him that she was pregnant, not made of glass. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter. Georgia continued to work, though she gradually turned over the more physically demanding tasks to their employees as her belly grew. She found that she enjoyed the changes in her body, the tangible evidence of the new life growing inside her. Harrison was constantly amazed by it, often resting his hand on her stomach to feel the baby kick, his expression one of almost reverent awe. They prepared the cabin for the baby's arrival, Harrison building a beautiful cradle from polished oak and Georgia sewing tiny garments and blankets. Mrs. Wilson came up from town several times to check on Georgia and offer advice, as did several other women from Apache Junction, who had become friends over the past year and a half. Georgia went into labor on a warm May evening in 1880, just as the sun was setting over the mountains. Harrison rode immediately for Mrs. Wilson, who served as midwife for much of the territory, and then spent the long hours of Georgia's labor alternating between pacing anxiously and holding her hand while she worked through contractions. "You are doing beautifully," he kept telling her, his voice rough with emotion. "So strong, so brave." Georgia, sweating and exhausted, managed to give him a tired smile. "Tell me that again in a few hours," she said, then gasped as another contraction hit. Their son was born just before dawn, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. Harrison cut the cord with shaking hands, tears streaming openly down his face as he looked at the tiny, perfect human they had created together. "He is beautiful," Harrison said, his voice choked. "He is absolutely perfect." Georgia, exhausted but exhilarated, reached for the baby and cradled him against her chest. He had a shock of dark hair and eyes that, though still the cloudy blue of all newborns, she suspected would turn the same striking gray-blue as his father's. "What should we name him?" she asked. They had discussed names extensively over the past months, but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Harrison said, "James, after your father, if that is all right with you." Georgia felt tears spring to her eyes. "James Harrison Pike," she said softly, testing the name. "It is perfect." Baby James proved to be a healthy, happy child who filled their cabin with new sounds and new rhythms. Harrison was a devoted father, taking to the role with the same wholehearted commitment he brought to everything he did. Georgia would often find him in the rocking chair at odd hours, holding James and singing to him in a low, gentle voice, or talking to him about the mountains and the stars, and all the things they would do together when James was older. The mining operation continued to thrive, and by James's first birthday, they had expanded to include 3 separate shafts and a workforce of 15 men. Georgia managed the business side of things, keeping the books and handling negotiations with buyers, while Harrison oversaw the day-to-day operations and ensured the safety of their workers. They made a formidable team, respected throughout the territory for their integrity and business acumen. When James was 2, Georgia became pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and while the pregnancy was somewhat more difficult than the first, she weathered it with determination and grace. Their daughter was born in the winter of 1882, a tiny, delicate thing with Georgia's coloring and what promised to be Harrison's stubborn chin. "What do you think of the name Rose?" Georgia asked, looking down at the infant sleeping in her arms. "Rose Ellen Pike," Harrison said, including Mrs. Wilson's name in tribute to the woman who had attended both their children's births. "I think it is beautiful." Life settled into a new normal, busy and full and rich with love. James grew into an adventurous, curious boy who followed his father everywhere, asking endless questions about everything he saw. Rose was quieter, more observant, but with a determined streak that made it clear she would be a force to be reckoned with as she grew. The children loved the story of how their parents met and would often beg Harrison and Georgia to tell it again. They especially loved the part about the tree, about how their father had carved his name beside their mother's to make it permanent. "Can we go see it?" James asked when he was about 5 years old. "Can we go see the tree with your names?" So they made it a family tradition, riding down from the mountains every year on Harrison and Georgia's anniversary to visit the cottonwood by the creek. The children would run and play in the water while Harrison and Georgia sat in the shade, watching them and remembering that day when their lives had intersected and changed forever. Over the years, they added to the carvings the dates of their children's births, the year they paid off the last of the loans on the mining operation and became fully solvent, small marks and initials that chronicled the major moments of their lives together. The mining operation eventually became one of the most successful in the territory, and Harrison and Georgia used their wealth to invest in the community. They funded the construction of a hospital in Apache Junction, endowed scholarships for young people who wanted to pursue education, and supported various charitable causes throughout Arizona. But they never forgot where they came from, never lost touch with the hard work and determination that had built their success. As the years passed, and Arizona moved from territory to statehood, Harrison and Georgia grew older but no less devoted to each other. Their hair grayed and their faces lined, but the love in their eyes when they looked at each other never dimmed. They added 2 more children to their family, another son and another daughter, and eventually grandchildren began to arrive, filling their lives with new joy and new purpose. Through it all, the cottonwood tree stood as a testament to their love, the carvings weathered but still visible. Local people began to know the story, and the tree became something of a landmark. Young couples would sometimes make pilgrimages there, carving their own names in emulation of Harrison and Georgia, hoping for even a fraction of the happiness that the Pike family had found. On their 50th wedding anniversary in 1929, Harrison and Georgia made one final trip to the cottonwood. They were both in their 70s now, their bodies less willing than they once had been, but their spirits still strong. Their children and grandchildren wanted to throw them a large party, but they had insisted on this one day alone together first, revisiting the place where it had all begun. They sat in the shade of the old tree, Harrison's arm around George's shoulders, looking at the names they had carved so long ago. Time had weathered them, but they were still there, still together, just as Harrison had promised. "You ever regret it?" Harrison asked softly. "Staying here instead of going back east? Taking a chance on a rough mountain man you barely knew?" Georgia turned to look at him, at the face she loved more than any other, and smiled. "Not for a single second," she said. "You gave me everything I never knew I wanted. Adventure and purpose and a love deeper than I ever imagined possible. You gave me a family and a home and a life worth living." She paused, then added, "The only thing I might have changed is that I should have carved my name faster, so you would have found me sooner." Harrison laughed, the sound rich and warm even after all these years. "I found you exactly when I was supposed to," he said. "Not a moment too soon or too late." He pulled out his knife, the same one Georgia had used to carve her name all those years ago, and below all the other marks and dates, he carved one final message: 50 years of love. Georgia watched, her eyes misty with happy tears, then leaned her head against Harrison's shoulder as they sat together in the golden afternoon light. Around them, the desert stretched vast and beautiful, the mountains rising purple in the distance, the creek murmuring its eternal song. And on the trunk of an ancient cottonwood, 2 names remained carved side by side, a permanent testament to a love that had begun with a chance encounter and grown into something that would outlast them both. Their children found them there later, still sitting beneath the tree, and together the whole family shared a meal and told stories and laughed at memories both old and new. James, now a grown man with children of his own, looked at his parents and saw in them the model of what a marriage should be. Rose, married herself and living in Phoenix, felt grateful for the example they had set, for showing her that true love was not just passion but partnership, not just attraction but deep and abiding friendship. As the sun set and the family prepared to head home, George's youngest grandchild, a girl of 6 named Harper, tugged on her sleeve. "Grandma, will you tell me the story again, about how Grandpa carved his name beside yours?" Georgia smiled and picked up the little girl, settling her on her hip despite the protest of her aging back. "Well," she said, "it was a very hot day in 1878, and I had ridden out to a creek in the middle of nowhere because I was sad and wanted to be alone." As she told the familiar story, Harrison came to stand beside her, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that had become second nature over 50 years of marriage. Their eyes met, and in that glance was contained everything they had built together, all the joy and sorrow and triumph and struggle that had made up their lives. When the story was finished and little Harper had been satisfied, they all mounted up and began the ride back to the main house that Harrison and Georgia had built closer to town once the children had grown, and the mountain cabin became too isolated for their aging bodies to manage comfortably. But Harrison and Georgia hung back for a moment, taking one last look at the cottonwood tree. "Thank you," Georgia said softly, "for making it permanent." "Thank you," Harrison replied, for carving your name in that tree on that particular day in that particular place so that I could find you." They kissed, a gentle brush of lips that held 50 years of love and commitment, then rode off together into the gathering dusk, side by side as they had been since that fateful day when a mountain man found a woman carving her name in a tree and decided to carve his name right beside hers, making a promise that would last a lifetime and beyond. The mining operation was eventually sold to a larger concern, but the money was carefully managed and invested, ensuring that the Pike family would be financially secure for generations. Harrison and Georgia lived out their final years in comfort and contentment, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had inherited their work ethic, their integrity, and their capacity for deep and lasting love. Harrison passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1932, at the age of 78. Georgia held his hand as he drew his last breath, whispering words of love that only he could hear. She followed him 2 years later, and they were buried side by side in the cemetery in Apache Junction, their headstones simple but elegant, bearing both their names and the dates of their birth and death, along with a single line, "Together forever." But their true monument was not the headstone in the cemetery. It was the cottonwood tree by the creek, where their names remained carved side by side, a permanent reminder of a love that began with a simple act of courage and grew into something legendary. The tree stood for many more years, becoming a pilgrimage site for lovers, and a symbol of enduring commitment. And even after the tree finally fell, brought down by age and weather and the inexorable passage of time, the story lived on. In Apache Junction and throughout Arizona, people still told the tale of Harrison Pike and Georgia Harper, the mountain man and the prospector's daughter who found each other in the wilderness and built an empire on love and hard work. Parents told their children, and those children told their children in turn, passing down the story of how sometimes the greatest treasures are not found in mines or mountains, but in the hearts of the people we meet along the way. The silver mine that Georgia's father had started and that she and Harrison had built into a thriving enterprise eventually played out, as all mines do. But by then, the Pike family had diversified their investments, and their legacy extended far beyond mining. The hospital they had founded still served the community, bearing their names on a plaque in the entrance hall. The scholarships they had endowed had sent hundreds of young people to college, many of whom returned to Arizona to build their own lives and contribute to their communities. But perhaps their greatest legacy was the example they had set, the proof that true love could exist even in the hardest of circumstances, that two people who barely knew each other could take a chance and build something beautiful and lasting. They had shown that romance was not just for storybooks and fairy tales, but could be found in the real world by people brave enough to reach for it. Their children and grandchildren carried forward the tradition of returning to the site of the old cottonwood on anniversaries and special occasions. Even after the tree itself was gone, they would gather at that spot by the creek, sharing meals and memories and reinforcing the bonds of family that Harrison and Georgia had forged. They would tell the story again and again, never tiring of it, finding new meaning in it as they grew older and experienced their own loves and losses. And sometimes, when the light was just right and the wind whispered through the remaining trees, it seemed almost possible to see them there still, Harrison and Georgia, young and in love, standing beside the cottonwood with their names carved side by side, smiling at each other with the knowledge that they had found something rare and precious that would endure long after they were gone. The story of Harrison and Georgia Pike became part of the folklore of Arizona, taught in schools and referenced in books about the history of the territory. Historians debated the exact details, tried to separate fact from legend, but the essential truth remained unchanged. A mountain man had found a woman carving her name in a tree, and he had carved his name right beside hers, making a commitment that would shape not just their lives but the lives of everyone who came after them. In the end, perhaps that was the real magic of their story. Not that it was perfect or without struggle, but that it was real. That two imperfect people had found each other at exactly the right moment, had recognized something worth fighting for, and had devoted themselves to building a life together based on love, respect, and unwavering commitment to each other. The desert winds still blow through Apache Junction, the mountains still rise purple and gold in the distance, and the creek still runs where it always has, murmuring its eternal song. And though the cottonwood tree is gone and Harrison and Georgia have been dead for nearly a century, their love story endures, carved not just in bark but in the hearts and memories of all who hear it, a permanent testament to the transformative power of love and the courage it takes to write our names alongside another's and make it permanent.